The Ossuary Reach was not a place where starlight went to die, but rather where it lingered, trapped in the ancient dust of dead worlds and forgotten ambitions. Located at the turbulent nexus of several collapsed faster-than-light jump routes, it was a sprawling cosmic graveyard of cold rock, rogue asteroids, and an absolute, suffocating silence. Officially, the wider galactic community recognized this vast expanse as untamed neutral territory, a dead zone devoid of any strategic or resource value. In reality, the Soryn Ascendancy had quietly and methodically woven its invisible, iron-clad borders around the Reach over the past 2 decades. They treated the sector as an unspoken, natural extension of their Imperial domain. They did not petition the galactic councils for treaties. They did not ask for diplomatic recognition. They simply occupied the void with their shadow, daring any lesser civilization to challenge their silent, overbearing claim. Fleet Hierarch Drell Carr was an apex predator in a uniform, a man who profoundly understood the delicate architecture of military intimidation. In his long, highly decorated career, spanning over 40 years of service, he had never recorded a single tactical defeat. To a commander of his caliber, war was rarely a matter of raw, chaotic combat. It was a precise mathematics of overwhelming presence. He had brought exactly 9 formidable Soryn warships into the Reach during this rotation for exactly this reason. They were angular, predatory vessels, their hulls gleaming with the slick, iridescent sheen of active kinetic energy shields. Their plasma engines burned with a fierce, violet intensity, casting long, aggressive shadows across the drifting debris of the sector. Their mission today was beautifully simple: to deliver a harsh, unforgettable border lesson to a lone, straying human vessel that had wandered entirely too deep into what the Ascendancy considered its backyard. 9 capital-class destroyers arrayed against one single cruiser. It was not designed to be a battle. It was designed to be a public execution of authority. Yet, as the Soryn fleet dropped out of slipspace and their sensors stabilized, the visual telemetry captured an image that fundamentally defied standard military logic. The human warship hung dead in the center of the void, manifesting as a sheer, absolute black cut against the brilliant tapestry of distant, burning stars. It was incredibly long, impossibly dark, and possessed a brutalist, utilitarian geometry that seemed to absorb the ambient starlight rather than reflect it. Its transponder designation read simply as the United Earth Systems vessel, Quiet Ash. The ship's massive hull was a heavy tapestry of old combat scars, deep carbon scorches, and jagged, uneven weld lines. However, it did not look decrepit, failing, or obsolete. Instead, it looked incredibly dense. It resembled a primal beast that had lived for an impossibly long time, weathering centuries of catastrophic violence, and simply refused to submit to death. It carried the heavy, undeniable mass of a veteran that had seen the end of worlds. Any rational captain in the known galaxy, upon seeing 9 heavily armed Soryn dreadnoughts collapse into local space in an aggressive attack formation, would have reacted instantly. Drive engines would flare into life. Defensive particle shields would snap into full rigidity, and targeting lasers would scatter frantically across the dark void in a desperate, panicked search for a survival solution. The Quiet Ash did absolutely nothing of the sort. It registered 0 forward acceleration. Its defensive energy grids remained entirely dormant, completely cold to the thermal sensors. There was no desperate scramble to lock retaliatory weapons onto the approaching alien armada. It merely sat anchored in the crushing silence of the Ossuary Reach. Along its massive, bruised flanks, thick strips of stark white illumination pulsed in a slow, rhythmic, unbroken sequence. The heavy lights swelled into brilliance and then faded into dimness with the steady, measured, unbothered cadence of a colossal creature's heartbeat. It was merely observing the pack of predators that had come to circle it. Drell Carr stood rigidly on the elevated command deck of his flagship, his primary mandibles tight with a complex mixture of professional annoyance and a faint, uncharacteristic curiosity. He gestured sharply to his chief communications officer, silently ordering him to open a broad-spectrum, unencrypted channel. Drell broadcasted a standard, uncompromising Imperial demand for immediate identification, engine shutdown, and total surrender. His tone dripped with the heavy, bored superiority of a conqueror who had delivered this exact speech 100 times before to 100 different terrified captains. The response came back almost instantly. It did not carry the expected chaotic static of scrambling technicians or the frantic whispering of a panicked bridge crew. Instead, it arrived with a pristine, chillingly unfiltered clarity. "This is Commander Iona Kier of the United Earth Systems vessel, Quiet Ash," the voice stated. It was a human female's voice. What struck Drell immediately, causing a slight twitch in his posture, was the absolute lack of atmospheric tension in her words. She was profoundly calm, geometrically precise, and entirely devoid of the micro-harmonic tremors that universally indicated fear, stress, or anxiety in carbon-based life forms. She spoke with the casual cadence of someone confirming a routine logistical delivery, not someone staring down the barrel of 9 capital ships capable of cracking a moon. "We are currently operating within designated neutral space, engaged in a fully sanctioned transit vector," Commander Kier continued, her tone remaining perfectly leveled, like a flat horizon line. "We acknowledge your tactical presence, Soryn Ascendancy fleet. However, we have absolutely no intention of altering our current trajectory, powering down our systems, or vacating this sector based solely on an Empire's self-proclaimed and legally unrecognized territorial claim." A physical ripple of quiet, profound shock washed over the pristine Soryn bridge. Officers exchanged brief, bewildered glances. It was not simply the raw defiance that stunned them. It was the sheer administrative boredom with which the defiance was delivered. The human commander had casually dismissed the apocalyptic military might of 9 elite warships by citing a bureaucratic technicality. Drell narrowed his 4 eyes, leaning his heavy, armored bulk against the primary tactical console. He prepared to issue the verbal command to power up the forward magnetic railguns, fully intending to shear a high-velocity warning shot directly across the human ship's bow to shatter their ridiculous composure. But before he could even draw the breath to speak the command, Iona Kier's voice filled the bridge once more, effortlessly preempting his tactical escalation. "Furthermore, Fleet Hierarch Carr," she said. Drell froze. She had used his exact rank and full name, a granular intelligence detail she should not have easily possessed without deep cover espionage. "We are perfectly aware that your active targeting computers are currently painting our exterior hull," she continued, her voice echoing coldly through the cavernous Soryn command center. "Before you make a final decision regarding weapons free, you are officially authorized to conduct a deep structural scan of this vessel. We invite you to do so. You may scan us as deeply and thoroughly as your technology allows, if you truly wish to see the whole truth of what you are currently aiming at." The Soryn command deck plunged into a profound, suffocating silence. The ambient, mechanical hum of the flagship's life support systems suddenly seemed deafeningly loud. A trapped target simply did not invite a deep scan. A deep scan stripped away all tactical dignity and secret advantages. It revealed reactor vulnerabilities, precise weapon yields, exact crew complements, and delicate shield harmonics. In naval warfare, it was an act of complete and utter military submission. Yet, the way the human commander offered it, wrapping the invitation in perfectly polite syntax, felt remarkably like a softly spoken, incredibly dangerous threat. Drell stared intensely at the massive, dark silhouette of the Quiet Ash displayed on the main tactical viewer. His highly trained mind raced violently through the tactical algorithms of 100 past victories, desperately searching for a precedent. He aggressively rationalized the humans' bizarre behavior as the ultimate, pathetic manifestation of naivety. They were, after all, a remarkably young species, barely scratching the surface of complex galactic politics. They likely believed that total, humiliating transparency would earn them a measure of Soryn mercy. Or perhaps it was simply an absurd, theatrical display of juvenile arrogance, a desperate psychological attempt to bluff an undefeated hierarch into second-guessing himself. He scoffed quietly, the abrasive sound vibrating deep in the back of his throat. He would absolutely call her childish bluff. He would peel back the iron skin of her ugly ship. Let his computers calculate the exact, pitiful measure of their insignificance. And then, he would deeply enjoy watching them scramble and flee once they realized how utterly outmatched they were in the cold reality of the void. Initiate a full, multi-layered deep-spectrum scan. Drelkar commanded his sensor officers, his heavy voice cutting sharply through the lingering, tense silence of the bridge. Tear that black ship apart layer by layer. Let us see exactly what truth these arrogant humans think they are hiding in the dark. Senior sensor specialist Tovik Wren leaned over his primary console, his long fingers dancing rapidly across the slick, haptic interface. The command had been given. He initiated the multi-layered deep-spectrum sweep, a predatory piece of Soryn technology specifically designed to mentally undress an enemy vessel. Standard naval procedure dictated that a sensor pulse of this extreme magnitude would peel back a target like a surgeon parting flesh. It was engineered to mercilessly read molecular structures, map thermal energy grids, count biological life signs, and inventory weapon magazines down to the very last kinetic slug. It was an invasive, absolute violation of a ship's physical integrity, usually resulting in a beautifully organized, perfectly predictable holographic schematic hovering obediently above Tovik's desk. He triggered the active pulse. A wave of invisible, high-frequency tachyonic radiation washed out from the flagship, instantly flooding the dark silhouette of the human cruiser. Tovik waited for his system to auto-compile the standard return. He waited for the familiar, fragile green wireframe of a mass-produced human hull to materialize on his screen. Instead, his console spat out a rapid cascade of amber error codes, immediately followed by a chaotic burst of raw, violently unformatted data. He frowned deeply, his mandibles clicking in minor, professional frustration as he manually forced the diagnostic filters to widen and process the heavy static. As the initial noise cleared and the true physical composition of the quiet ash began to render, Tovik felt a distinctly cold prickle of deep confusion slide slowly down his spine. The outer armor of the human vessel was entirely wrong. It completely lacked the homogeneous, poured alloy consistency expected of a standardized, modern military warship. The Soryn database contained extensive, highly detailed profiles on human metallurgical engineering, categorizing their ships by predictable titanium and carbon silicate blends. This hull, however, was a jarring, chaotic contradiction to every known schematic. The deep scan revealed exactly 23 distinct, interlaced material layers compressing the ship's massive skeleton. Far more alarming was the fact that the Ascendancy computer could only successfully identify 19 of those layers. 4 of the heavy shielding strata registered as absolute unknown composites, completely absent from the Empire's vast intelligence libraries. Tovik magnified the visual resolution, isolating a massive section of the port side outer plating. The holographic projection shifted, detailing the microscopic topography of the armor. It was an astonishing, brutal patchwork of sheer survival. Entire sections of the heavy plating bore the unmistakable microscopic scarring of manual fusion welding. These were not pristine sheets rolled seamlessly out of an automated orbital shipyard. They were scavenged, salvaged, and cannibalized pieces of other destroyed vessels, painfully grafted onto the quiet ash over what must have been decades of continuous, grinding conflict. It was a terrifying monster of naval architecture, a ship that had bled, lost pieces of itself, and violently stitched the thick armor of the dead over its own open wounds just to keep fighting. He adjusted the sub-frequency phase arrays, attempting to push the beam deeper into the hull's thermal management layer. This was the exact moment when his minor technical anomaly morphed into an active, creeping psychological unease. Under the intense, localized bombardment of the high-spectrum scan, the surface of the human cruiser did not behave like dead metal. A standard ship would simply reflect the tachyonic particles back to the source, acting as a dumb mirror bouncing light. The quiet ash was doing something fundamentally, impossibly different. It was deliberately absorbing a calculated fraction of the Soryn scanning energy. Tovik watched in mounting disbelief as the raw data streams confirmed the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. The human ship was actively taking their highly intrusive sensor pulse, stripping its phase alignment, and then reflecting it back in a highly ordered, algorithmic pattern. The ship was not just passively sitting there being measured by a superior force. The heavy armor itself was acting as a massive, distributed sensor array. By artificially altering the bounce-back telemetry, the quiet ash was actively analyzing the very technology that was trying to analyze it. It was feeling the sharp edges of the knife pressed against its throat, mapping the exact shape of the Soryn targeting matrix, and silently logging the precise frequency of their invasive gaze. "It is looking back at us," Tovik realized, his throat suddenly completely dry. He forcefully redirected his attention, slicing the scan laterally to examine the superficial, violent scoring on the hull. A ship's physical scars always told the true story of its enemies. The Soryn intelligence network had rigorously documented every known weapon signature employed by humanity and its localized galactic rivals. But as Tovik ran the complex metallurgical damage profiles against the Imperial archives, the system returned a chilling, endless string of negative matches. There were massive, spiraling burn channels dug deep into the forward ablative armor that completely defied conventional plasma mechanics. There were horrific, jagged kinetic impact craters that strongly suggested the use of hyper-dense exotic matter rounds, a devastating technology the humans were absolutely not supposed to possess. There were thousands of microscopic, fractal-like lacerations dragged across the starboard sensor vanes that resembled no known energy weapon in the civilized galaxy. The data was utterly unequivocal. The quiet ash had not just survived border skirmishes. It had waded through apocalyptic, undocumented wars against adversaries the Ascendancy did not even know existed. It carried the undeniable physical evidence of violent conflicts, systematically erased or entirely absent from the Imperial history books. Desperate for something recognizable, something he could easily classify and dismiss, Tovik pushed the scan hard through the outer plating, penetrating the micro-coatings designed to prevent orbital dust corrosion. As that thin digital layer peeled away, the holographic viewer suddenly illuminated with hundreds of thousands of microscopic anomalies etched directly into the bare, cold metal beneath the black paint. At first glance, Tovik assumed they were complex industrial serial numbers, the mundane manufacturing stamps of 1,000 different orbital foundries. But the decryptor algorithms instantly rejected that logical hypothesis. He zoomed in on a single, heavily scarred plate salvaged from what looked like a destroyed dreadnought-class vessel. The text slowly translated, rendering itself clearly onto his screen. It was not a production code. It was a name. Beneath the name was a specific date, and beneath that date was a long string of localized planetary coordinates. He frantically panned the camera across the rest of the hull. Millions of lines of tightly packed text covered the buried layers of the thick armor. Names, dates, coordinates. They were written in dozens of different terrestrial languages, placed carefully alongside several intricate alien scripts that Tovik's machine deeply struggled to identify. The entire warship was not just a weapon of mass destruction. It was a colossal, flying monument. It was an obsessive archive of the lost etched permanently in tungsten and steel, deliberately buried beneath heavy layers of armor, so that the memory of the dead would only be destroyed if the ship itself was entirely vaporized. Tovik felt a cold, heavy sweat form beneath his rigid collar. The immense psychological weight of what he was looking at began to press terribly against his chest. He slammed his hand against the console, driving the scan violently past the memorial armor and deep into the internal architecture of the cruiser. He needed to find the main reactor, the primary magazines, the critical structural weaknesses. He needed to find the fragile things that could be broken. The internal schematic blossomed into existence, and once again, every ounce of his standard naval doctrine was completely shattered. A typical Soryn warship was designed around a linear, highly efficient spine, prioritizing maximum energy transfer from the central reactor to the forward heavy weapon arrays. If you snapped that spine, the ship died instantly. The Quiet Ash possessed no single, vulnerable spine. Its internal layout resembled a maddening, recursive labyrinth. The ship was heavily compartmentalized into a series of massive, independent, concentric rings, built exactly like a fortified bunker buried within a bunker, buried within another bunker. Each massive ring possessed its own independent auxiliary power substations, its own localized life support loops, and its own fully redundant command pathways. Tovik ran a rapid, simulated catastrophic damage model. If he fired a heavy, ship-killer plasma torpedo directly through the outer two rings, instantly devastating exactly 50% of the vessel's total mass. The simulation showed the inner core simply slamming its heavy blast doors shut and continuing to operate with terrifying, unbroken efficiency. It was a vessel inherently designed to absorb horrific, ship-breaking punishment and absolutely refuse to die. It could be blown into a dozen burning pieces, and every severed piece would remain a fully functional, heavily fortified stronghold. Tovik Ran's hands hovered unsteadily over his brightly lit display, trembling very slightly. His highly trained mind, conditioned for decades to evaluate threats based purely on raw offensive firepower and maximum shield integrity, deeply struggled to process this entirely new, horrifying paradigm of warfare. He reached out with a heavy finger and tapped a specific, glowing command key, officially logging a Tier 1 tactical red flag into the fleet's shared combat network. This was a monumental, terrifying deviation from anything they had anticipated. The mighty Soryn Empire built its warships to project absolute power, to strike fast, and to win decisively in the opening salvos. The dark, battered vessel floating silently in the cold of the Ossuary Reach was fundamentally, philosophically different. It was not a light patrol cutter meant to aggressively harass boarders. It was not a fragile, heavily armed frontline destroyer built for glorious, high-speed assaults. It was a survivor. It was a machine meticulously, obsessively engineered over decades of unrecorded trauma to simply endure the absolute worst the universe could possibly throw at it. It was built to absorb suffering, to outlast its enemies, and to ensure that whatever horrific truths it witnessed in the dark would never, ever be forgotten. The tactical readout on the Soryn sensor console shifted its focus from defensive architecture to offensive capabilities, and Tovik Ren prepared himself for the familiar, blinding red glare of heavy artillery signatures. Soryn naval doctrine dictated that a warship's lethality was directly proportional to the visible size of its plasma batteries and the sheer number of its missile silos. An empire projected power by ensuring its weapons were the most prominent, intimidating features on the hull. The human cruiser defied this aesthetic of intimidation entirely. As the deep scan washed over the primary weapon hardpoints, Tovik found no massive, overcharged energy emitters or towering, ostentatious railgun turrets designed to strike fear from a distance. Instead, he found blank, heavily armored recesses. The ship featured dozens of empty, standardized modular bays running along its ventral and dorsal ridges. The implications of this bare, utilitarian design crashed into the sensor specialist with the weight of a physical blow. The humans had not deployed a ship with a fixed, rigid combat role. They had built a versatile weapons platform, capable of completely swapping its tactical configuration in the middle of a protracted campaign. If the enemy adapted to their kinetic strikes, the human crew could simply rip out the railguns and bolt heavy laser emitters into the universal sockets without ever returning to a dry dock. It was an aggressively pragmatic approach to war, stripping away all Imperial pageantry in favor of raw, adaptable function. However, the main axial spine of the cruiser was far from empty. Housed deep within the heavily shielded central column were two massive, highly specialized projectors. Tuvok's computer struggled for several agonizing seconds to classify them, eventually returning a designation pulled from highly classified, deeply buried intelligence archives: Horizon Lances. Tuvok felt the blood drain from his extremities. A Horizon Lance was not a weapon designed to violently blow an enemy dreadnought into expanding clouds of vapor. It was something far more insidious and strategically devastating. Instead of discharging raw thermal energy at a physical target, the dual projectors were engineered to fire hyper-compressed gravimetric pulses directly into the localized fabric of space. Upon detonation, these pulses violently tore at the stability of the surrounding dimensional membrane, effectively shredding the complex physics required for faster-than-light travel. The human ship was not aiming to instantly obliterate the 9 Soryn destroyers. It was aiming to mutilate the jump routes around the Ossuary Reach, instantly locking the entire Ascendancy fleet inside the battlefield. The humans were not holding a sword to the Empire's throat. They were quietly locking the only door out of the slaughterhouse. Moving his attention to the port and starboard flanks, Tuvok highlighted massive, honeycomb-like arrays of launch tubes running the entire length of the vessel. Initially, he categorized them as standard torpedo silos, expecting a heavy barrage of smart munitions. But the microtelemetry revealed something entirely different. The tubes were packed tight with thousands of autonomous, uncrewed drones. In Soryn tactical manuals, a drone was a fragile, single-purpose tool, usually deployed for basic reconnaissance or light-point defense harassment. The human drones packed inside this dark cruiser were terrifyingly multifunctional. The deep scan exposed complex internal schematics within the tiny machines. They were equipped with high-intensity plasma welders, advanced electronic warfare suites, and densely packed explosive cores. They were not just weapons. They were a synthetic swarm capable of dynamically shifting roles in the heat of combat. They could swarm over the human ship's own hull to rapidly patch catastrophic armor breaches, project massive clouds of fake sensor ghosts to completely blind Soryn targeting computers, or suddenly accelerate into the void, transforming into relentless, intelligent pursuit mines that would hunt down crippled enemy fighters. The sheer logistical endurance of the vessel became even more horrifying as Tuvok inspected the primary munition magazines. For a capital ship of this immense size, the dedicated storage bunkers for kinetic slugs and explosive warheads registered as absurdly, almost suicidally small. According to Soryn tactical logic, this ship would entirely deplete its ammunition reserves within the first 2 hours of a heavy engagement, leaving it defenseless. Then, the sensor beam penetrated the heavily reinforced mid-deck, and the terrifying truth of human logistics was laid bare. Beneath the small magazines sat a sprawling, heavily industrialized materialization foundry. It was an automated, brutalist factory bolted directly into the heart of the warship. Massive, crushing intake hoppers led into high-temperature plasma furnaces and molecular resequencers. The ship did not need to carry a massive stockpile of ammunition because it was designed to manufacture its own weapons in the middle of a firefight. The automated foundry was explicitly engineered to consume raw material from the immediate environment. It could slowly swallow floating rogue asteroids, grind down the shattered debris of its own destroyed armor plating, or, most chillingly, pull in the drifting, dead wreckage of Soryn warships to recast their alien alloys into fresh human artillery shells. It was a self-sustaining cycle of violence, a ship capable of literally eating the dead to continue killing the living. Tovik frantically reviewed the propulsion readouts, searching for any critical weakness in their energy consumption. The Soryn dreadnoughts relied on explosive, high-yield plasma drives, built for terrifying speed and overwhelming shock and awe maneuvers. The human drive core, by stark contrast, was not optimized for lightning-fast orbital raids. It was a marvel of strategic, grinding endurance. It utilized a massive, low-frequency sustained fusion loop, heavily insulated by advanced thermal sinks that perfectly balanced the ship's internal heat generation. It could not outrun a Soryn destroyer in a straight sprint. But it did not need to. The engineering profile proved that this vessel could hold a single tactical position in deep space for 7, 8, or even 9 continuous months. It could endure complete logistical isolation, bleeding its thermal signature perfectly into the void, and simply outlast an entire enemy blockade through sheer, mechanical stubbornness. Desperate to find a tactical advantage for his infantry, Tovik ran a simulated boarding action protocol, mapping the internal access corridors for a potential marine insertion. The results were a nightmare of lethal geometry. The human ship was fortified against hostile boarding to a level of extreme, paranoid obsession. The internal architecture was not static. Modular bulkheads could dynamically shift, completely altering the layout of the corridors and trapping Soryn strike teams in dead-end steel labyrinths. Every single passageway possessed independent atmospheric controls, allowing the human commander to instantly vent the oxygen from contested zones, freezing invaders in the vacuum of space. The floors and ceilings contained hidden, interlocking kinetic crush traps, turning standard hallways into mechanical meat grinders. Sending elite Soryn shock troops into that shifting, hostile maze would not be a glorious conquest. It would be a slow, agonizing mass suicide. Tovik Wren compiled the disparate streams of data into a single, comprehensive tactical assessment and routed it directly to the command throne. His hands were now visibly shaking. He had calculated the exact nature of the threat. The Quiet Ash was highly unlikely to unleash a spectacular, overwhelming barrage of firepower that would instantly vaporize the entire Soryn armada in the first minute of combat. It lacked the flashy, world-ending alpha strike that the Ascendancy heavily relied upon for rapid subjugation. Instead, the human ship offered a far more agonizing demise. It would use the Horizon Lances to forcefully lock the 9 destroyers inside the dead zone. It would release its endless drone swarms to blind their sensors and endlessly repair its own wounds. It would sit absolutely perfectly still, weathering the Soryn plasma barrages with its impossible armor. And then, it would begin to fire back. When it ran out of bullets, it would simply grind down the surrounding debris and forge new ones. It would break the fast, aggressive rhythm of Soryn naval doctrine, dragging the pristine, arrogant dreadnoughts down into the mud of a long, ugly, attritional siege. It would bleed them out, slowly and methodically, crushing them one by one until nothing remained but drifting scrap metal for its forge. Sitting on his elevated command throne, Fleet Hierarch Drelkar read the scrolling tactical summary. The cold, sharp spike of his first true unease firmly lodged itself deep in his chest. For the first time in his celebrated, undefeated military career, he looked at the dark silhouette on the screen and fully understood the terrible philosophy of human warfare. This lonely, battered ship had not been deployed to the Ossuary Reach to merely threaten them for the sake of political posturing. It had been meticulously engineered, from its shifting corridors to its gravity-tearing lances, to violently and permanently conclude military campaigns that other, more arrogant species mistakenly believed they controlled. The sensor beam shifted its spectrum, abruptly abandoning the cold, hard geometries of armor plating and weapon hardpoints to seek out the soft, warm vibrations of carbon-based life. Senior Sensor Specialist Tovik Wren engaged the biological analysis matrix, fully anticipating the chaotic, bright red telemetry of mass panic. When a lone cruiser found itself cornered by an overwhelming Imperial armada, the internal biological sensors usually lit up like a dying star. Heart rates would violently spike into the danger zones. Raw adrenaline would flood neural pathways, and the collective atmospheric temperature of the target ship would physically rise from the sheer, radiating body heat of terrified prey. Soryn naval intelligence relied heavily on this data. Reading an enemy's terror was the first step in breaking their spirit. The scan washed smoothly through the heavy, layered bulkheads of the human cruiser and returned a remarkably dense population count. There were well over 1,000 human beings aboard the vessel. However, they were not scrambling frantically through the internal corridors in a blind, chaotic panic, nor were they huddled together in reinforced escape pods, weeping for salvation. Every single individual was locked perfectly into a designated combat station. The Soryn sensors mapped the sprawling internal layout in terms of living heat, painting a chilling picture of absolute readiness. Deep within the engineering blocks, heavy damage control teams stood perfectly still beside their sealed bulkheads, holding heavy plasma cutters and structural sealant, simply waiting in the dark. At the apex of every shifting corridor and reinforced choke point, heavily armored marine contingents held their defensive positions in absolute, unbroken silence. In the lower, heavily shielded decks, expansive medical bays blazed with stark, sterile white light, fully prepped and staffed by surgeons standing quietly beside rows of empty, immaculate trauma beds. The humans were entirely, flawlessly ready for a massacre. But it was the advanced stress analysis readout that truly paralyzed Tovik, sending a deep, unnatural chill through his carapace. The Soryn psychological profiling engine was a marvel of Imperial intelligence, meticulously designed to read the emotional degradation of an enemy force. It categorized degrees of terror, measured the exact threshold of breaking morale, and told Soryn commanders exactly when to broadcast the demand for surrender. Tovik stared at the cascading biological data, his mind entirely unable to process the physiological impossibility unfolding directly on his screen. There was absolutely zero panic. There were no erratic, terrified heartbeats thumping wildly against ribs. There was no hyperventilation, no cold sweats, no involuntary muscle tremors. Instead, the Soryn computer detected a massive, unified physiological rhythm. Across the entire length of the sprawling cruiser, the heartbeats and breathing patterns of over 1,000 human beings were slowly falling into a perfectly synchronized, cyclical alignment. It was not the rigid, artificial synchronization of a cybernetically controlled hive mind, but rather the organic, deep-breathing cadence of a long-practiced, collective ritual. They were inhaling and exhaling in a slow, heavy unison, bleeding their excess stress into the ship's recycled air, deliberately calming their central nervous systems through sheer, drilled discipline. Desperate to find a flaw, Tovik pushed the scan deeper, targeting the collective neural activity of the human crew. He fully expected to find the deadened, sluggish brainwaves of soldiers heavily dosed with military-grade combat sedatives, artificially numb to the impending horror of their violent deaths. Or, conversely, he thought he might find the bright, jagged neural spikes of feral, cornered aggression. He found neither. The cognitive telemetry painted a picture of chilling, profound clarity. Their brains were bathed in a steady, powerful hum of highly focused, collective anticipation. It was the exact neurological state of a master orchestra, in the heavy, breathless silence just a fraction of a second before the conductor raises the baton, or a seasoned, scarred fighter, exhaling one final time before stepping under the harsh lights of the blood-stained arena. It was not the magical absence of fear, but rather the absolute, mechanical subjugation of it. The Ascendancy's highly advanced tactical classification system began to violently glitch in response to the data. The sophisticated software ruthlessly cycled through its vast, millennia-old library of emotional states, desperately trying to assign a recognized label to the human crew. It tested the parameters for mass hysteria. The system rejected it. It tested for suicidal, religious fanaticism. The system rejected it. It cross-referenced the chemical markers for pharmacological sedation and chemical lobotomy. The system rejected both. Finally, entirely unable to comprehend a biological species that could face certain annihilation with a slowed heartbeat and a perfectly steady hand, the Soryn core processor simply surrendered. It bypassed every standard military designation in its vast archives and spat out a raw, unprecedented string of flashing warning codes, openly admitting to the Soryn bridge crew that it was observing a psychological state it had absolutely no programming to understand. Inside the heavily shielded command center of the human cruiser, the physical atmosphere was a direct manifestation of that chilling data. Commander Iona Kier was not nervously pacing the deck. She was not gripping the edges of her command console with white-knuckled terror, nor was she staring obsessively at the massive tactical hololith that displayed the 9 heavily armed Soryn dreadnoughts aiming their primary plasma batteries directly at her face. Instead, she sat comfortably in her worn command chair, calmly scrolling through a dense, secondary data pad. She was meticulously reviewing a digital inventory of cultural relics, ancient data drives, and forensic atmospheric samples that her engineering crews had recently salvaged from the dead. Drifting shipwrecks scattered throughout the massive graveyard sector. She checked off a line item regarding a petrified piece of alien pottery with the casual, measured attention of a civilian archivist doing routine paperwork on a quiet, entirely uneventful afternoon. A young tactical officer, standing rigidly at a secondary fire control station, watched the Soryn targeting lasers passively paint their outer hull. He swallowed hard, keeping his voice incredibly low and rigidly controlled, betraying only the absolute faintest sliver of youthful tension. He leaned slightly toward the central command chair. "Commander," the young officer asked, his hands hovering gracefully over the dark, unlit weapons console. "Are we simply waiting for the optimal tactical moment to return fire?" Iona Kier did not look up from her glowing inventory manifest. She swiped a single finger across the glass screen, quietly archiving a forensic file, and then let out a very soft, quiet breath. "No," she replied, her voice carrying easily and clearly across the hushed, hyper-focused space of the bridge. "We are not waiting to shoot. We are merely waiting for them to finish reading." Her words hung heavily in the recycled air, perfectly underscoring the true, profound horror of the vessel. The entire ship, from the quiet, calculating commander down to the lowest infantry marine, holding his breath in the dark corridors below, operated exactly like a single, massive organism that had simply practiced walking directly through the fire entirely too many times. There was no bombastic heroism to be found anywhere on the ship. There were no grand, defiant speeches echoing through the internal intercoms to miraculously rally the troops against impossible odds. There was no theatrical, desperate bravery. There was only something infinitely more terrifying. It was the cold, unglamorous, incredibly heavy weight of pure habit. They had stared directly into the deep abyss of overwhelming, apocalyptic odds so many times that the sheer, paralyzing terror of it had been completely eroded away, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard bedrock of absolute, mechanical procedure. They were entirely, deeply comfortable operating in the direct shadow of death. Back on the pristine, brilliantly lit command deck of the Soryn flagship, Fleet Hierarch Drelkar stood perfectly still, watching the unprecedented biological warning codes flash angrily across his primary viewer. He listened to the agonizing, heavy silence radiating outward from the black human vessel. For the entirety of his long, highly decorated life in the Imperial military, Drell had always confidently interpreted an enemy's silence as the ultimate, undeniable proof of their submission. Silence meant a shattered command structure. Silence meant paralyzing, mind-breaking terror. Silence meant that a glorious Soryn victory was merely minutes away. But as he stared intently at the flat, synchronized breathing rhythms of a human crew that absolutely refused to panic, that fundamental, lifelong belief violently crumbled into dust. He realized with a sudden, suffocating clarity that the deep, heavy silence emanating from the human ship was not the silence of the defeated. It was the terrifying, infinitely patient stillness of a veteran predator that had already set its elaborate snare, carefully checked the tension on the killing wire, and was simply waiting for the arrogant prey to take the final, fatal step. The deep spectrum sensor beam, having successfully mapped the stoic human crew and the labyrinthine internal corridors of the cruiser, finally slammed into an impenetrable wall deep beneath the ventral line of the massive vessel. Senior Sensor Specialist Tovik Wren stared at his console in profound frustration. The lowermost belly of the ship possessed an armored thickness that was entirely disproportionate to any standard naval architectural logic. But it was not the physical metal that halted his intrusive sweep. It was a localized, highly advanced quantum state disruption field. The area was cloaked in a shielding material so aggressively designed to scatter tachyonic radiation that Tovik found his initial pulse completely fractured into useless digital static. Determined to break through, he manually overrode the flagship's safety protocols. He shifted his sensor array to a secondary, highly concentrated penetrating spectrum. The screen remained dark. He wiped a cold layer of sweat from his brow, recalibrated the harmonic resonance of the emitters, and forced a second phase shift, pushing the Soryn technology closer to its absolute thermal limits. Again, the human shielding violently rejected the intrusion, throwing back a wall of blinding white noise. Gritting his mandibles, Tovik executed a third, brutally invasive frequency shift, pouring nearly dangerous levels of raw energy into the scanning beam. The flagship's computer systems whined in sharp, electronic protest, but the heavy digital veil finally, agonizingly tore open, revealing the absolute deepest secret hidden within the belly of the human warship. Standing on his command podium, Fleet Hierarch Drell leaned forward, his massive shoulders tensing. He fully expected to look upon the ultimate human contingency plan. He braced himself to see the terrifying schematics of a localized singularity warhead, a cascading dark matter bomb, or some horrific, world-ending biological payload designed to turn the entire Ossuary Reach into a dead zone forever. He was a military man. He understood the language of doomsday weapons. But the tactical display did not render a bomb. It rendered a vast, hyper-cooled, utterly pristine cavern composed of towering, crystalline pillars. It was a massive quantum server farm, an archive of staggering scale and complexity. As the Soryn computer forcibly extracted and translated the surface-level metadata from the human servers, the true nature of the vault began to cascade across the bridge's main holographic viewer. It was not a repository of military targeting algorithms or automated combat routines. It was an impossibly dense library of memories. The screens flooded with vast oceans of civilian data, complex legal frameworks, sweeping planetary street maps, intricate architectural blueprints, volumes of poetry, mathematical theorems, and high-fidelity recordings of alien music. Tovik's breath caught in his throat as the Soryn translation matrix automatically matched the linguistic and cultural roots of the data. The archive contained the complete, meticulously preserved digital souls of exactly 7 distinct alien civilizations. According to every official Imperial history book taught within the Soryn Ascendancy, those 7 civilizations had been entirely extinct for generations. The official galactic records stated they had faded away naturally, tragic victims of their own planetary mismanagement, sudden stellar anomalies, or unfortunate, localized cosmic accidents. Yet, As the Soryn sensors dug deeper into the human archive, a far more terrifying layer of data emerged. Interwoven with the cultural artifacts were thousands of massive, heavily encrypted forensic files. The human warship was carrying physical and digital evidence. The Soryn flagship's tactical computer, operating on automatic threat analysis protocols, began cross-referencing these human forensic files with its own deeply classified, highly secured Imperial military databases. The results began to flash across Tovik's screen in a rapid, horrifying sequence of perfect, undeniable matches. The human archive contained highly detailed atmospheric ignition models from dead worlds. The Soryn computer instantly matched those precise models to the unique, proprietary plasma bloom signatures of Soryn heavy orbital bombardment platforms. The human servers held complex, reconstructed gravimetric wave patterns tracking the movement of unknown fleets through the extinct systems. The Soryn computer seamlessly overlaid those exact trajectories with the highly classified, historical deployment routes of Soryn Black Operations Armadas. The archive contained physical metallurgical samples of shattered alien cities, and the microscopic scorch marks perfectly matched the localized energy outputs of Soryn infantry rifles. The horrifying reality struck Drell like a physical blow to the chest. The United Earth Systems vessel was not merely a warship designed to hold a line or win a dogfight. It was a flying, heavily armored courtroom. It was a battleship built specifically to safeguard evidence. It was an indestructible fortress, engineered to carry a massive, irrefutable indictment across the stars. The secret, bloody pacification campaigns that the Soryn Ascendancy had spent decades brutally executing and then meticulously burying in the dark corners of the galaxy were not buried at all. The humans had quietly followed behind them, sweeping the ashes, collecting the shattered pieces, and perfectly reconstructing the actual truth. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing biological proximity alarm rang out from Tovik's console, violently shattering the heavy silence of the bridge. The deep scan had detected life signs completely segregated from the human crew. Deep within the heavily reinforced core of the quantum archive, the sensors isolated a perfectly sealed, environmentally controlled chamber. Inside the chamber sat exactly 21 independent, heavily shielded cryogenic stasis pods. Tovik frantically focused the biological telemetry on the pods. They were active. Inside them were living, breathing adult life forms, suspended in deep, perfectly stable hibernation. The Soryn computer immediately analyzed their genetic markers and returned an identification that made Tovik physically recoil from his desk. The people sleeping inside the human ship belonged to a prominent, influential civilization that Soryn Imperial historians had explicitly, officially documented as having entirely succumbed to a massive, naturally occurring planetary plague exactly 3 centuries ago. The Ascendancy had used that tragic plague as the legal justification to annex their highly resourceful, abandoned star systems. They were not dead. The humans had somehow found them, saved them, and kept them alive in the dark for hundreds of years. Trembling, Tovik examined the physical release mechanisms hardwired into the stasis pods. They were completely severed from the human cruiser's central command network. Commander Iona Kier could not open those pods even if she wanted to. The awakening sequence was physically hard-coded to a complex, multi-layered galactic consensus protocol. The stasis locks would only disengage, and the survivors would only be thawed when the human ship's external sensors positively registered the immediate, physical presence of officially recognized, non-combatant diplomatic observers from multiple, neutral galactic powers. The strategic implications slammed into Drellkar, completely paralyzing his highly strategic mind. The humans had not dragged these 21 living ghosts out to the dangerous edge of the Ossuary Reach, simply to keep them hidden. They had not brought them here to quietly negotiate a ransom or to engage in standard border blackmail. They had brought them here to set a stage. The human warship was waiting for an audience. Drell's primary hearts hammered painfully against his ribcage as the absolute, crushing genius of the human trap finally closed around his throat. The cold, paralyzing dread washing over him had absolutely nothing to do with human firepower anymore. The Soryn Ascendancy could easily claim that any data broadcasted by a human ship was completely fabricated, a clever piece of digital slander designed to weaken the Empire. It was a standard political defense. However, that defense had just been entirely, permanently destroyed. The human commander had politely invited Drell to scan her ship. She had permitted him to use the Soryn flagship's own, highly advanced, cryptographically signed, and officially verified Imperial sensor technology to read the vault. Drell's own computers had just processed the data, matched the forensic burn patterns to Soryn weapons, and verified the living genetic codes of the supposedly extinct survivors. By conducting the deep scan, the Soryn flagship had essentially digitally notarized the human evidence. Drell's own military hardware had just authenticated the horrific crimes of his own empire, securely logging the verification into the fleet's permanent, unalterable tactical memory core. If this human ship survived, and if neutral observers arrived to open those pods, the physical evidence combined with the Soryn's own, verified scan data, would carry vastly more destructive weight than any diplomatic accusation or formal declaration of war. It would completely shatter the political legitimacy of the Soryn Ascendancy across the entire civilized galaxy. The Empire would not be seen as a harsh but necessary force for order. It would be exposed as a prolific, systematic butcher of worlds. The expansive, beautifully designed command bridge of the Soryn flagship was packed with dozens of highly trained, heavily armed elite officers. Yet, as the horrific, undeniable weight of the Soryn's own history beamed back at them from the dark human ship, the room suddenly felt incredibly, suffocatingly empty. For the very first time in their proud, Imperial lives, they fully understood that the human vessel had sat silently in the dark, not out of fear, but because it actively, desperately wanted them to look upon the most terrifying weapon in the known universe with their own eyes. They were completely trapped in a cage made entirely of their own forgotten sins. Fleet Hierarch Drell Carr tore his gaze away from the tactical and biological displays that had systematically dismantled his entire understanding of naval warfare. The physical and psychological reality of the human vessel was now established, but the strategic intent behind its solitary presence remained a terrifying void. He turned sharply toward his chief intelligence officer, Sail Tree. The usually impassive intelligence specialist was currently staring at his own secure data slates with a profound, unblinking intensity, his breathing shallow and rapid. Drell issued a sharp, low command, ordering the immediate extraction and synthesis of every updated intelligence file concerning human expansion, their obscure space archaeology initiatives, and any highly classified data linking their young species to the silent graveyard of the Ossuary Reach. Sail Tree's long, multi-jointed fingers moved rapidly across the glowing interface, pulling deep historical data from the Ascendancy's vast, highly compartmentalized espionage networks. For over 40 years, the Soryn High Command had largely ignored human border activity, comfortably categorizing them as a minor, eccentric species overly obsessed with digging through dead rocks and ancient ruins. Now, as the compiled data flooded the secondary command monitors on the flagship bridge, that dismissive Imperial arrogance evaporated into a cold, suffocating dread. The intelligence revealed a staggering paradigm shift in how power could be projected. Over the past 4 decades, while aggressive empires like the Ascendancy expanded their borders by violently subjugating rich, vibrant colonies and planting territorial flags on resource-heavy worlds, humanity had chosen a completely different, almost incomprehensible path. They had not built traditional military outposts or sprawling commercial hubs along the highly contested frontiers. Instead, they had silently seeded the darkest, most desolate corners of the galaxy with automated rescue stations, deep space forensic laboratories, and highly specialized extinction recording vessels. They had systematically anchored themselves along the exact spatial corridors that had mysteriously vanished from standard galactic trade maps. Sail Tri highlighted a specific naval classification file, isolating the official designation of the black cruiser floating outside their viewport. The vessel was officially registered as a Witness-class strategic cruiser. It was a uniquely human concept, a ship category that possessed absolutely no equivalent in any other military vocabulary in the known universe. It was not built to conquer new territory, nor was it built to initiate a glorious first strike against an enemy armada. A Witness-class vessel was explicitly designed to arrive after the heavy bombardment had ended, after the planetary fires had burned out, but long before the executioners could finish sweeping the ashes and burying the evidence. Its primary operational directive was a matter of galactic historical preservation, to ensure that absolutely no civilization, no matter how small, primitive, or politically insignificant, could be violently erased from the galactic stage without a permanent, living record being meticulously secured. As Sail Tri pulled up the broader human naval registries to provide context, the true, towering scale of the strategic threat became horribly clear to the Soryn officers. The total number of Witness-class cruisers in the active human fleet was not exceptionally large, but they were perfectly, strategically distributed to cover the most volatile, politically sensitive borderlands in the galaxy. However, the most terrifying revelation extracted from the espionage files was not the ships themselves, but their specific position within the human military hierarchy. The Witness class was not their apex predator. It was merely the appointed observer. The deeply buried intelligence files contained heavily redacted, shadowy silhouettes of other, vastly superior human ship classes. There were massive siege dreadnoughts, rapid strike orbital platforms, and deeply brutal line breakers that humanity kept intentionally chained far behind their own heavily fortified borders. The Witness class was wrapped in impossible armor, precisely because it was never expected to win a major war on its own. It was heavily armored, so it could survive a surprise attack just long enough to scream into the dark, signaling for the real monsters to be unchained. The operational philosophy governing this fleet was codified in a single, unyielding military doctrine that Sail Tri translated aloud for the silent bridge. The words hung in the recycled air, incredibly heavy and absolute. No extinction without record, no record without response. To fully understand the terrifying weight of that doctrine, Sail Tri opened a final set of historical archives, focusing on human internal legal affairs and military tribunals. The Ascendancy, like all great, expanding empires, routinely covered up the atrocities committed by its own generals, rewriting history to protect its national pride and maintain absolute order. Humanity, the historical records unequivocally showed, did the exact opposite. Sail Tri read from the translated transcripts of a tribunal that occurred nearly 20 years prior. A highly revered human fleet commander, a man who had successfully defended their core worlds from a massive, unprovoked alien incursion, had been put on trial by his own civilian government. His crime was the unauthorized, total atmospheric incineration of an enemy outpost that had already offered a conditional surrender. The Soryn Ascendancy would have given such a ruthless, effective commander a high honor and quietly erased the surrender transmission from the logs. The humans, however, gave him a massive public trial, systematically stripped him of his military honors, and executed him. More importantly, they broadcast the entire grim affair across open, unencrypted frequencies for the entire galaxy to witness. They did not hide their violent shame. They weaponized their own accountability. This bizarre, seemingly self-inflicted transparency had achieved something no amount of Soryn firepower or diplomatic bribery could ever buy. It had earned them the absolute, unshakable trust of the minor, neutral species across the galaxy. Countless independent systems implicitly trusted the human legal framework and their forensic integrity far more than they trusted the hollow victory declarations or peace treaties of any expanding empire. If humanity presented a piece of evidence, the galaxy implicitly believed it, because humanity had repeatedly proven they were entirely willing to burn their own heroes at the stake for the exact same crimes. The disparate pieces of the grand strategic puzzle violently snapped together in Drelkar's mind, shifting the current situation from a mere tactical headache into a catastrophic, empire-ending disaster. The scale of the horror expanded rapidly from the technical prowess of the ship to the historical weight it carried. If he gave the order to open fire on the human cruiser, the narrative would instantly, permanently slip from his control. It would no longer be a simple, easily deniable border skirmish over a patch of empty, worthless rocks. The moment Soryn plasma struck the human hull, it would be universally recognized as a desperate, guilty empire attempting to assassinate a legally appointed galactic investigator in broad daylight to destroy the irrefutable proof of a murdered civilization. The diplomatic fallout would be apocalyptic. Every single neutral trade partner, every hesitant political ally, and every terrified vassal state within the Ascendancy's massive sphere of influence would instantly understand that Soryn was actively, violently trying to cover up a historical genocide. The crippling economic blockades would form within days. The unified military coalitions, backed by the sudden, terrifying arrival of the heavier human fleets, would follow shortly after. By attempting to silence the witness, the Ascendancy would inadvertently confess to every single crime buried in the dust of the Ossuary Reach. For the first time since he had taken command of a warship many decades ago, Fleet Hierarch Drelkar looked at the solitary, dark vessel floating in the silent void and felt a profound, chilling respect. The thick fog of Imperial arrogance finally lifted, and he understood the breathtaking brilliance of the human deployment strategy. He finally understood exactly why they had only sent a single ship. Sending a massive, heavily armed invasion fleet into the Reach would have instantly provoked a conventional war, allowing the Soryn Ascendancy to easily rally its citizens against a massive foreign aggressor. But sending one ship, exactly the right type of ship, positioned in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, fundamentally altered the rules of galactic engagement. The human cruiser was a perfectly engineered, indestructible political tripwire. It was not dangerous because it could destroy the Soryn fleet in a firefight. It was infinitely more dangerous because it forced the Soryn fleet into an impossible corner, forcing them to choose between retreating in absolute humiliation or completely destroying their own empire by pulling the trigger. Senior sensor specialist Tovik Wren could not tear his eyes away from the residual data streams bleeding across his terminal. The deep scan had finished. The impossible secrets of the human quantum archive were laid bare. Yet the system logs continued to compile with a strange, heavy latency. His mandibles twitched in sharp, erratic bursts. He commanded the system to run a standard diagnostic sweep on the primary sensor array, assuming the intense energy output had simply fried a minor relay. The diagnostic returned a perfectly clean bill of health. But there was a glaring anomaly buried deep within the raw telemetry of the backscatter. During the very first phase of the scan, when the tachyonic beam had violently collided with the patchwork outer armor of the United Earth Systems cruiser, Tovik had noticed the armor absorbing and reflecting the energy in an ordered pattern. He had assumed the human ship was merely analyzing the Soryn beam to map their targeting frequencies. He was catastrophically wrong. The human vessel had not just been looking at them. It had actively reached back along the very beam of light Soryn had fired. Tovik frantically isolated the anomaly. It was a microscopic, incredibly elegant packet of data that had seamlessly attached itself to the returning sensor pulse, slipping right past the flagship's heavy cybernetic firewalls, because it was riding comfortably inside Soryn's own authenticated frequency band. His breath hitched painfully in his throat. Soryn naval doctrine dictated an immediate, total system purge the moment foreign code was detected. He slammed his fist onto the console, initiating the Purge Protocol, bracing his entire body for a violent cyber warfare counterattack. He fully expected the human code to aggressively encrypt their navigation computers, shut down the life support grids, or forcefully overload the primary reactor core. The Purge Protocol simply washed over the anomaly and did absolutely nothing. The human data packet was not a destructive virus. It was not a malicious worm designed to cripple a warship in the heat of battle. It was something infinitely more precise and infinitely more legally devastating. It was an automated forensic authentication protocol. Tuvok's hands shook violently as the flagship computer finally translated the true function of the stowaway code. By executing an unauthorized, highly invasive deep-spectrum scan on a foreign vessel operating within an internationally recognized neutral zone, the Soryn command structure had unwittingly triggered a digital trap. The human protocol had not stolen a single piece of tactical information from the Ascendancy flagship. Instead, it had utilized the Soryn sensor array to forcibly verify the Ascendancy's own identity and actions. In the span of exactly 4 seconds, the protocol had meticulously recorded Fleet Hierarch Drell Carr's personal encrypted command cipher directly from his active console. It had logged the unique, proprietary energy signatures and specific transponder codes of all 9 Soryn dreadnoughts. It had mapped the exact, undeniable spatial coordinates of their aggressive ambush formation. It had even captured the synchronized biological markers of the entire Soryn bridge crew, proving beyond a shadow of a legal doubt that this was not a rogue splinter faction acting without orders, but an official, fully sanctioned Imperial military operation. The human warship had just used Soryn's own aggressive action to completely, officially notarize the Soryn fleet's presence at the scene of the galaxy's greatest hidden crime. The Ascendancy had just digitally signed its own indictment. "Hierarch," Tuvok choked out, his voice cracking horribly under the crushing weight of the revelation. "Look at the localized spatial grid." Drell Carr shifted his heavy gaze from the primary tactical display to the localized environmental map. For the past hour, the Soryn sensors had casually categorized the vast, drifting fields of metallic debris surrounding the Ossuary Reach as exactly that: dead, useless junk. They were the shattered, frozen remains of ancient trade vessels and forgotten mining outposts, cold and entirely silent. Suddenly, the environmental map began to violently update, refreshing at a blinding speed. The Soryn sensors, now permanently entangled with the human authentication protocol, began to register a massive, synchronized awakening out in the dark void. One by one, tens of thousands of incredibly faint, dormant energy signatures flared to life across the entire sector. They were not hidden human warships dropping out of stealth. They were the pieces of debris themselves. The humans had quietly seeded the entire Ossuary Reach with a vast, invisible network of microtransmitters, perfectly disguised as dead iron and shattered rock. And now, triggered by the completed forensic handshake between the 2 flagships, the network was opening its eyes. The Soryn fleet was completely surrounded by a massive, interconnected sphere of transmission beacons. Sail Tri, the chief intelligence officer, immediately analyzed the network's transmission architecture, and the color rapidly drained from his usually stoic face. The mechanics of the trap finally snapped shut with the cold, heavy finality of a prison door. The human cruiser was directly linked to the newly awakened beacon network. If Drell Carr gave the order to power the primary plasma batteries, if even a single Soryn munition struck the heavy hull of the Quiet Ash right now, the kinetic impact would instantly trigger the final phase of the protocol. The moment the human armor registered a hostile strike, the massive quantum archive hidden in its belly would unlock. The meticulously gathered evidence of the extinct civilizations, the living genetic codes of the frozen survivors, and, most crucially, the freshly notarized undeniable proof of the Soryn fleet's current hostile actions, would be compressed into a single, massive data burst. The tens of thousands of surrounding beacons would catch that burst, exponentially amplify it, and simultaneously hurl it across the void to dozens of heavily populated, highly influential neutral star systems. However, the intelligence readout also revealed the inverse condition. If the Soryn fleet simply held their fire, the broadcast would remain completely sealed. The data packet would stay locked securely within the human hull, leaving a desperately narrow, incredibly fragile window for diplomatic negotiation and joint, public verification of the facts. The sheer, terrifying brilliance of the human strategy washed over the bridge in a suffocating wave, dropping like a guillotine blade on their Imperial ambitions. Soryn military doctrine was built entirely on the concept of overwhelming, punitive escalation. If an enemy pushed, Soryn pushed back 10 times harder. The Ascendancy relied heavily on the brutal threat of superior firepower to force immediate compliance from weaker species. But the humans had fundamentally rewritten the rules of the encounter. The trap the humans had laid was not a standard promise of mutual destruction. They were not saying that if Soryn dared to shoot, a hidden human armada would jump in and shoot back. The true, horrifying ultimatum was entirely different. If Soryn dared to shoot, they would instantly, permanently transform themselves into universally recognized war criminals in front of the entire watching galaxy. Drelkar stood entirely motionless, the heavy ceremonial plates of his armor suddenly feeling like a suffocating cage. He had spent his entire life mastering the brutal, bloody arithmetic of naval warfare. He knew exactly how to calculate shield degradation, fleet maneuvers, flanking routes, and acceptable casualty margins. But the humans had just dragged him into a completely different kind of equation. An equation that had absolutely no clean, victorious exit for a galactic bully, relying on its terrifying, ancient reputation. He had brought 9 world-crushing dreadnoughts to ruthlessly dictate terms to a single, battered cruiser. He had fully intended to teach them a final, agonizing lesson in Imperial authority. Instead, the lone human ship had effortlessly stripped away all of his power, not by disabling his weapons, but by making it completely, politically suicidal to ever use them. Every single plasma battery under his command was fully charged, locked onto the target, and utterly, totally useless. The legendary undefeated fleet hierarch realized with a sickening drop in his stomachs that the only thing left that could possibly save the Soryn Ascendancy from total, systemic annihilation was not their overwhelming firepower, nor their impenetrable shields. The only remaining path to survival relied entirely on his own ability to swallow his towering, imperial pride and accept a devastating, humiliating reality much faster than his ego could demand a violent retaliation. The heavy, oppressive silence on the Soryn command deck had stretched to its absolute breaking point. Fleet Hierarch Drelkar realized that staring at the terrifying tactical telemetry would yield no further salvation. The mechanical trap was flawless. He needed to look the architect of this disaster directly in the eyes. With a sharp, rigid gesture of his armored hand, he ordered the communications officers to establish a direct, unencrypted visual link with the human command center. The massive primary holographic projector at the center of the bridge hummed deeply, its ambient light shifting from the cold tactical blue to a stark, unfiltered white. The image resolved with pristine, agonizing clarity. Commander Iona Kier materialized before the Soryn elite. Drell scrutinized her image, searching for the telltale signs of a desperate gamble. He expected to see a sweaty, frantic officer gripping her console, heavily armed Marines pacing nervously in the background, or perhaps a theatrical display of arrogant bravado meant to mask a deep, underlying terror. He found none of it. Iona Kier sat perfectly upright in a worn, utilitarian command chair. Her dark blue uniform was immaculately neat, entirely devoid of the ostentatious, glittering medals and ceremonial sashes that adorned every Soryn officer in the room. Her bridge was dimly lit, quiet, and completely orderly. She did not look like a warrior trapped in the crosshairs of an Imperial armada. She looked like a meticulous auditor sitting at her desk, calmly waiting for a very late client to finally arrive at a mandatory meeting. There was no theatrical ruse, no dramatic posturing. She possessed the chilling, absolute stillness of someone who was merely executing a preordained administrative task. Before Drell could open his mandibles to issue a formal diplomatic greeting, Iona spoke. The sound that echoed through the cavernous Soryn bridge struck the officers with the force of a physical kinetic impact. She did not use the standard, automated galactic translation matrix. She spoke directly in high Soryn Imperial dialect. It was not the broken, heavily accented stumbling of a hastily programmed linguistic software. It was flawless. She perfectly executed the complex, guttural throat tones and the subtle, rhythmic inflections that usually required a native speaker's biological jaw structure to master. The linguistic precision carried a terrifying strategic implication that Drell instantly recognized. A human could not achieve that level of flawless, nuanced fluency by cramming a digital dictionary into their neural lace a few hours before a battle. This level of linguistic mastery required deep, immersive study. It meant she had not stumbled into the Ossuary Reach by accident. It meant humanity had been meticulously planning this exact conversation, tailoring it perfectly to this specific empire, for many long, unbroken months. "You have reviewed the registry, Fleet Hierarch," Iona stated calmly, her eyes locking directly onto the primary optical sensor of her screen, effectively staring Drell down. "You have seen the foundation beneath the dust." Drell stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing loudly on the polished deck. He needed to understand the core motivation driving this madness. "You invite your own annihilation," Drell rumbled, his voice dark and heavy with genuine bewilderment. "You bring a single vessel to challenge the sovereign expansion of the Ascendancy. You deliberately expose yourselves, knowing we possess the firepower to erase you from the void in a fraction of a second. Why orchestrate this elaborate, suicidal theater? What possible tactical advantage does your species gain by dragging these buried secrets into the light?" Iona did not blink. Her expression remained entirely devoid of malice, anger, or fear. "Because we cannot allow an empire to build borders on the bones of the dead and call it order," she replied. Her voice was not raised, yet it commanded the absolute attention of every single alien officer in the room. It was a statement of heavy, immutable fact. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands flat on the console in front of her. "Our objective in this sector is not military conquest. We are here to establish a permanent, internationally recognized neutral corridor. We require unrestricted forensic access to every single debris field within this designated zone. We intend to construct a shared, public memorial space. And, most importantly, we are here to ensure that your silent, unrecorded annexation campaigns end today. We will not allow the shadows of this graveyard to be used as a convenient rug under which you sweep the pulverized remnants of inconvenient civilizations." Drell felt a sharp twist of irritation pierce through his strategic dread. She was issuing terms of surrender to a fleet that outgunned her 1,000 to 1. He instinctively wanted to threaten her, to remind her of the 9 plasma batteries currently painting her hull. "You speak incredibly boldly for a commander sitting on a floating coffin," Drell countered, narrowing his eyes. "You assume your little data trap protects you. But if I give the command to fire, you will burn long before your precious beacon network finishes its transmission. You will not live to see the political fallout you so desperately desire." The Soryn officers waited for the human to flinch, to defensively remind them of the diplomatic consequences she had engineered. Instead, she offered a response that chilled the room far more effectively than the vacuum of space outside. She did not say that he would regret firing. She did not promise vengeance. "My personal survival is completely irrelevant to the current equation," Iona said smoothly, her tone as casual as someone discussing the weather. The forensic authentication protocol is fully autonomous. The stasis revival triggers are entirely decentralized. The deep space transmission relays are physically severed from my command override. The system has been painstakingly set to do its job exactly as designed. It makes absolutely no difference if I am sitting in this chair breathing, or if I am vaporized into a cloud of atomic ash. The truth will be broadcast. The only variable remaining is your participation. She had completely neutralized the threat of death by calmly accepting it as a non-factor. Drell realized he could not intimidate an adversary who had already factored her own violent demise into the opening steps of her tactical flowchart. Desperate to regain any semblance of control, Drell pivoted his interrogation toward the broader strategic picture. If humanity was willing to sacrifice this ship, they surely had a hammer waiting to strike the anvil. Soryn intelligence had hinted at the heavier, darker aspects of the human naval armada. And when the broadcast is sent, Drell began, his voice dropping an octave, testing the waters of the larger war. When you force this diplomatic catastrophe upon us, how many of your heavier warships are sitting out there, waiting just beyond the sensor veil in the deep dark? How many of your unseen fleets are ready to jump into this sector the moment the first shot is fired? The entire Soryn bridge held its collective breath. This was the moment of truth. If she named a massive number, it would be a direct military threat, a challenge to open combat that Soryn doctrine might demand they answer. Iona Kier looked directly at the Soryn commander. Her response was not a boast of overwhelming numerical superiority. It was an infinitely heavier, perfectly calculated psychological strike. They are close enough to change a wrong decision, Iona answered softly. And they are far enough away that you still have the absolute right to choose. A profound, icy chill swept through the ranks of the Soryn elite. That single, perfectly constructed sentence completely broke their Imperial confidence. She was not aggressively flexing her military muscles. She was declaring an absolute, unshakable faith in the massive strategic architecture standing invisibly behind her lone vessel. She was telling Drell that humanity possessed the power to instantly intervene and crush his armada. But they were deliberately holding that power back, forcing the Soryn hierarch to be the sole author of his own empire's destruction or salvation. She was handing him the executioner's blade and politely inviting him to decide whose neck to place on the block. Iona sat back in her chair, the stark lighting casting sharp shadows across her face. The negotiation, from her perspective, was effectively over. She had delivered the parameters. This is the conclusion of our initial exchange. Fleet hierarch, Iona stated, her flawless Soryn dialect carrying a tone of absolute finality. The path forward is entirely yours to chart. The Ascendancy may choose to stand down its weapons. You may join us in a process of mutual verification, cooperative excavation, and open diplomatic negotiation regarding the future of the Ossuary Reach. We can build a memorial together. She paused for a fraction of a second, letting the weight of the alternative settle over the Soryn flagship. Or, she concluded quietly, you may open fire right now and successfully prove to the entire watching galaxy that the mighty Soryn Ascendancy fears the simple truth far more than it fears the fires of a total, systemic war. I await your final decision. The visual link severed abruptly, collapsing into a pinpoint of white light before vanishing entirely. The main holographic projector returned to the cold, blue tactical display of the silent, heavily armored human cruiser. Drell Carr was left standing on his podium, the absolute master of a vast, invincible armada that had just been entirely neutralized by a few quiet sentences and a terrifyingly steady gaze. Fleet hierarch Drell Carr issued the command that completely broke his pristine, decades-long record of unyielding military aggression. He ordered his 9 capital dreadnoughts to entirely reverse their heavy plasma drives, pulling the formidable armada far beyond the maximum effective range of their forward batteries. leaving the silent, scarred human cruiser behind in the crushing dark of the neutral zone, felt exactly like swallowing pulverized glass. The slipspace journey back to the Imperial capital world of Soryn Prime was not a triumphant return. It was shrouded in a suffocating, heavy funeral atmosphere. He was returning not as a glorious, conquering hero of the Empire, but as a reluctant messenger, carrying a localized political apocalypse. The Conclave of Nine convened in the vaulted obsidian amphitheater, situated at the very apex of the primary Imperial palace. The massive chamber was explicitly designed by ancient architects to intimidate, built with towering, sharp shadows and harsh, highly focused spotlights. The 9 supreme counselors sat on an elevated, semi-circular stone dais, staring fiercely down at Drell, as if he were a treasonous defector awaiting public execution, rather than their most highly decorated, undefeated fleet commander. The political air inside the sealed room was instantly toxic, incredibly thick with wounded Imperial pride, barely contained fury, and desperate, clinging denial. Councillor Vile, the undisputed, aggressive leader of the militaristic Hawk faction, launched the first vicious verbal assault. He rose violently from his carved stone seat, his heavy ceremonial robes sweeping loudly across the floor. He spat bitter accusations of cowardice that echoed sharply off the high ceiling. Vile argued passionately that the human ship was nothing more than an elaborate, highly theatrical bluff designed to humiliate them. He insisted, his voice echoing with absolute conviction, that the forensic files were cheap digital forgeries. The stasis pods were highly likely filled with synthetic, manufactured corpses, and their greatest fleet hierarch had been completely paralyzed by a parlor trick performed by a lesser species. His proposed solution was brutally, predictably simple. Send the dreadnoughts back immediately. Execute a maximum yield thermal barrage to vaporize the human vessel in under 3 seconds, and then rapidly deploy millions of automated hunter-killer drones to systematically sweep the entire sector and destroy every single hidden transmission beacon before they could successfully transmit a single byte of data. Drell did not raise his heavy voice to match Vile's furious shouting. He merely stepped forward into the center of the harsh light and signaled for his senior officers, Tovik Wren and Sail Tree, to step up beside him. Drell coldly forced the Supreme Counselors to look directly at the one terrifying reality they desperately wanted to ignore. The core evidence permanently locking them into this nightmare had not been magically provided by the humans. Drell patiently, ruthlessly explained that the cryptographic signatures currently validating the forensic data belonged exclusively to the Soryn Ascendancy itself. He brutally informed the Conclave that to legally dismiss the human evidence as a forgery, the Council would have to publicly, officially declare that the Empire's most highly classified, impenetrable military sensor arrays were completely broken, useless, and easily manipulated by a technologically inferior species. It was a perfect, inescapable political trap that left absolutely no room for their standard Imperial arrogance. Senior Sensor Specialist Tovik Wren activated a portable holographic display, projecting the complex digital architecture of the human forensic protocol into the center of the silent room. He explained the authentication mechanism with the cold, terrified precision of a combat engineer, describing a live explosive strapped tightly to his own chest. He illustrated exactly how the hidden human network functioned in the dark. If Councillor Vile's aggressive strategy was enacted, if even a single stray plasma bolt violently grazed the heavy armor of the human ship, the autonomous system would instantly bypass all known Soryn jamming technology. The accumulated proof of historical genocide would automatically broadcast to dozens of heavily populated neutral systems in a matter of seconds. Tovik made it agonizingly, mathematically clear that a preemptive kinetic strike would not silence the evidence. It would act as the exact, irreversible trigger mechanism to unleash an unstoppable interstellar crisis. Sail Tri, the chief intelligence officer, stepped forward and delivered the killing blow to the hardliner argument. He projected a massive, interwoven digital web of current galactic trade routes over Tovik's schematics. He highlighted exactly 46 independent, highly resourceful neutral species currently engaged in critical economic treaties with the Ascendancy. Many of those specific governments had lost civilian exploratory fleets, diplomatic envoys, and rich merchant caravans in the so-called dead zones over the past 50 years. If the human archive was violently opened, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Soryn Black operation squadrons had systematically slaughtered those innocent travelers to maintain total border secrecy, the entire Imperial economy would completely disintegrate long before the first retaliatory shot was ever fired. Trillions of credits in vital commerce would vanish overnight. Fragile trade alliances would instantly shatter, and the heavily populated core worlds would face massive, uncontrollable supply riots within 3 months. The sheer, undeniable weight of the data momentarily silenced the massive chamber. But Councillor Vael absolutely refused to yield the fundamental philosophy of the Empire. He slammed his heavy fists violently onto the stone railing, screaming that giving in to human blackmail would permanently destroy the honor of the Ascendancy. He argued fiercely that an empire that negotiated out of pure fear instantly ceased to be an empire at all. He claimed their terrifying reputation, built painstakingly over thousands of years of glorious, bloody conquest, would simply die if they ordered a supreme fleet hierarch to bow his head and retreat from a single, pathetic human cruiser. Drelkar looked up at the furious politician, his 4 eyes completely devoid of their usual, burning military fire, replaced entirely by a cold, devastating exhaustion. He spoke with a quiet, razor-sharp intensity that cut cleanly through the councillor's desperate yelling. He stated that Imperial honor did not exist in a vacuum. If the 21 stasis pods sleeping silently in the belly of the human ship actually contained living, breathing citizens of a world that Soryn historical textbooks claimed died of a natural plague exactly 300 years ago, then Soryn honor had already been dead for centuries. The Ascendancy had been parading proudly around the galaxy, wearing the hollow, stolen skin of righteousness. The humans had not killed their honor today. They had merely dragged its rotting, undeniable corpse out into the harsh daylight and forced the Supreme Council to finally look at it. The conclave of 9 descended into a frantic, hushed, venomous debate. They absolutely despised Drell for bringing this apocalyptic reality directly to their doorstep. Yet they were utterly paralyzed by the airtight, irrefutable logic of his tactical assessment. They could not execute him for cowardice without ignoring the mathematical certainty of their own destruction. But they were culturally and historically incapable of completely surrendering their towering imperial pride in a single day. After several agonizing hours of bitter, sharp argument, they reached a desperate, agonizingly fragile compromise. They officially granted Drelkar the temporary, highly restricted authority to return his dreadnoughts to the Ossuary Reach. His strict, unyielding orders were to artificially prolong the diplomatic dialogue with the human commander. He was ordered to stall her, to speak endless words of peace and joint investigation on the open channels, simply to buy the struggling empire precious time. However, the political compromise was a jagged double-edged sword. While Drell was ordered to negotiate in the light, the conclave secretly authorized a massive, covert military escalation in the dark. They began silently mobilizing their 2nd, 5th, and 9th Grand Armadas, aggressively positioning them along the inner defensive perimeters, preparing for a war they still desperately hoped to win by sheer force. As Drell turned his broad back on the Supreme Council and walked slowly out of the towering obsidian chamber, the crushing paradox of his existence settled heavily onto his armored shoulders. He finally understood the true, terrifying nature of the impending conflict. The final, decisive battle waiting for him in the cold dark of the Reach was no longer a simple military engagement between the mighty Soryn Ascendancy and the United Earth Systems. It was a desperate, agonizing war between the inescapable gravity of the absolute truth and an empire's fatal, unyielding addiction to living entirely by its own fabricated myths. Fleet Hierarch Drelkar returned to the cold expanse of the Ossuary Reach with a heavy heart and a deeply fractured command structure. As his armada of 9 massive dreadnoughts dropped violently out of slipspace, tearing back into the silent graveyard of forgotten worlds, his visual sensors immediately sought out the human vessel. The United Earth Systems cruiser, the Quiet Ash, had not moved a single measurable fraction of an inch. It hung perfectly, chillingly still, against the vast backdrop of distant, burning stars. It possessed a terrifying, undeniable gravity, resting in the dark as if the entire spinning galaxy was forced to revolve around its battered, scarred hull, while it simply refused to yield to the pressure of the void. The delicate, agonizing stalemate between the two forces shattered entirely from within the Soryn ranks. Back on the Imperial capital world, the furious, hardline faction of the Conclave had bypassed Drell entirely. Desperate to protect their national myth, they transmitted a heavily encrypted, direct override command to 3 fiercely loyalist captains operating within Drell's own formation. Without the fleet hierarch issuing a single authorization, the massive forward plasma batteries on those specific destroyers began to hum with lethal intent. Their heavy weapon capacitors drew massive amounts of raw thermal energy, silently and aggressively preparing for a preemptive, devastating strike meant to vaporize the human vessel in a blinding flash of atomic fire. However, the human sensor net, deeply woven into the very fabric of the sector, caught the aggressive power spike the exact microsecond it occurred. Before the rogue, Soryn captains could even properly align their targeting lasers, the dead, freezing void of the Reach violently ignited. The millions of dormant, perfectly disguised transmission beacons that the humans had painstakingly seeded throughout the drifting debris fields awoke in perfect, terrifying synchronization. The oppressive darkness was instantly banished as a sprawling, 3-dimensional constellation of brilliant, golden light erupted across millions of cubic miles of open space. The shattered husks of ancient mining rigs, the frozen hulls of long-dead trade ships, and the floating remnants of pulverized asteroids suddenly became radiant, pulsing pillars of an immense, glowing network. The autonomous human protocol did not simply dump a messy pile of raw forensic files into the galactic ether. Instead, it activated a highly curated, deeply theatrical public broadcast mode. The awakened beacons projected colossal, high-fidelity holographic images directly into the vast, empty space, separating the heavy Soryn armada from the lone human cruiser. The Ossuary Reach transformed instantly from a dark, forgotten tomb into a blindingly illuminated, majestic hall of interstellar witnesses. Towering, luminous projections of alien faces filled the endless void. They were the ordinary citizens of the 7 vanished civilizations, rendered in stunning, vibrant, heartbreaking detail. Alongside their gentle faces, sprawling, glowing blueprints of their destroyed planetary cities rotated slowly and beautifully in the dark space. The heavy, oppressive silence of the graveyard was suddenly overwhelmed by the broadcasted audio of their lost languages. The beautiful, haunting melodies of their forgotten cultural music, and the joyful, ordinary ambient sounds of their long, vaporized streets. Floating ominously beneath these beautiful cultural monuments were stark, glowing sequences of military coordinates, matching perfectly and undeniably with the classified, bloody history of Soryn pacification campaigns. Then came the ultimate, undeniable stroke of human strategic genius. Just as the light from the memorial network reached its absolute peak, the localized space folded violently, and a dozen sleek, unarmed vessels dropped directly into the sector. They bore the shining diplomatic insignias of the galaxy's most prominent, highly respected neutral coalitions. They had followed the initial automated distress signal, jumping blindly into the tension to see the truth for themselves. The exact moment the neutral observers established a verified visual lock on the quiet ash, the human ship initiated its final, most devastating sequence. Down in the deepest, heavily shielded quantum vault of the cruiser, the 21 cryogenic stasis pods began their synchronized, automated awakening cycle. The biological telemetry of the reviving survivors, a species the Soryn Ascendancy firmly claimed had been dead for exactly 300 years, was broadcast live, entirely unencrypted, directly to the sensor suites of every newly arrived diplomatic vessel. A frantic, screaming transmission from the conclave tore through Drelkar's private communication earpiece. The Supreme Council ordered him to open fire immediately, commanding him to violently vaporize the human ship, the neutral observers, and the holographic ghosts in a desperate, mad attempt to forcefully restore their rapidly crumbling Imperial authority. They demanded blood to wash away the truth. Drell stood perfectly still on his elevated command podium, surrounded by the golden light of the resurrected dead pouring through the massive flagship viewports. He faced the greatest, most agonizing choice of his entire life, a choice that would permanently define the legacy of his entire species. He could obey the frantic, terrified politicians, squeeze the trigger, and preserve the terrifying myth of the Soryn Ascendancy for perhaps a few more chaotic hours before the United Galaxy descended upon them in righteous fury. Or he could commit the highest form of treason, openly defy the conclave, and desperately try to save whatever fragile, shattered piece of his civilization's honor still remained. He looked at the unyielding black hull of the human ship. He chose the future. With a swift, brutally decisive motion, Drell slammed his heavy fist onto the master control terminal, engaging the absolute, fleet-wide weapon lockdown protocol. He forcibly severed the rogue loyalist captains from their firing grids, draining the volatile plasma from every single cannon in the Armada. He then opened a massive, unencrypted broadband channel, broadcasting his heavy voice to the human commander, the frantic Soryn Council, and every single neutral observer floating in the illuminated graveyard. He formally declared a total, unconditional halt to all Soryn military escalation. He publicly acknowledged the immediate opening of the neutral corridor, officially ordered a permanent, binding freeze on all Imperial border expansion within the sector, and formally submitted the Soryn Ascendancy to the complete legal oversight of an independent, interstellar investigative committee. The mighty, undefeated fleet hierarch surrendered his pride without firing a single kinetic shot. On the quiet bridge of the quiet ash, Commander Iona Kier did not raise her hands in celebration. She offered no smug smile, no arrogant victory speech, and absolutely no mockery of a broken conqueror. She merely tapped her scarred console, officially and calmly acknowledging the Soryn stand-down order. She smoothly activated the medical relief protocols for the 21 terrified, newly awakened souls breathing fresh air in her lower decks. And in a voice as calm as still water, she formally proposed that they begin the construction of the galaxy's first joint memorial, right there in the beautifully illuminated dust of the Reach. The Ossuary Reach, a place that had been a silent, brutal slaughterhouse for many decades, was permanently, fundamentally transformed. It became the very first sector in the known galaxy where humanity had deployed a heavily armored, absolutely indestructible fortress, not to conquer a single inch of physical territory, but to forcefully compel the entire universe to remember the fallen. The terrifying truth about humanity was finally laid bare for the stars to witness. Their greatest, most dangerous weapon was not their capacity for catastrophic destruction. It was their boundless endurance, their chilling, calculating intelligence, and their absolute, unyielding stubbornness to ensure that the simple truth would always, inevitably survive far longer than the greatest empires ever built. Thank you all so much for listening to this story today, and please let us know in the comments where you are tuning in from, whether it is right here in Hanoi or somewhere halfway across the globe, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so that this story can be heard by even more people across the galaxy.